They change, and they understand reality in the way they are told in many, many ways. So manufactured consensus, as Herman and Chomsky very well articulated over 30 years ago, is real, and it's even more real today than it was 30 years ago. With toxification in Iran, among some of the elements, even right-wing elements of the government in Iran, is more actually more real today than it was 67 years ago when Ala Ahmad wrote it. So the power of imperialism has captured our imagination. So when Edward Said was talking about Orientalism, he was actually critiquing, as you know, critiquing why the Western structure of knowledge, the Western scholarship, when they study the Orient, they really are not studying the Orient for what it is. They are studying it for what they imagine it should be according to their own interest. It is pretty much the way Netanyahu described Palestinians. It is pretty much the same Trump administration describes Iranian government. And unfortunately, some of our Iranian colleagues, in fact, describe Iran and the conditions of Iran from the same Orientalized, captured, seduced perspective.
Professor Sharifi, I remember some years ago when I was in the States, and then I don't even remember if it was a Senate or House of Representatives. I don't know if it was a representative senator, but he was talking openly about the power of Hollywood, and he was saying this is our extended arm of influencing the young people, not only young, but the rest of people around the world, influencing them in a way with American values. So it's our soft power. I remember it very well. And back then, Professor Sharifi, I was a student in the United States. And accordingly, some years ago, President Putin in Russia said something which again brought me back to that. Not that, I'm just mentioning different people. President Trump, Putin, doesn't matter. President Pezeshkian, whatever. So Putin said that back then, that if you come and ask young people in Russia, right, in Russia, name me names of American cities and lifestyle, they know it much better than many. They can talk about St. Petersburg and possibly in Moscow and possibly one more city, but they know more American cities than Russians. And although many of them, either they don't speak fluent English or they speak, bit of English. But when I was in Russia, Professor Sharifi, when you turn on TV, you see American shows everywhere. I was in Mongolia, was the same. Every country I went to, you turn on TV, everyone is watching American. So Hollywood definitely shapes our mind or all these values. Do you agree with this statement?
I do agree. Hollywood as a little part of the general discourse of Western empire. Yes, it is Hollywood, not Hollywood, but combination of Hollywood US and Western universities, academia, the media outlets, the government, the civil society, and on. It's all connected together. Hollywood is a part of it. So the way things are framed is really important. And when they are framed in novels, actually, Edward Said focus was on novels, on literature, on Western literature, the way they described, in fact, the Orientals. And we see that in Iranian literature. As you would know, I mean, perhaps this example is too abstract at this point, but it came to my mind and I'm going to say it. There was a professor of medicine that came to Iran in the 1800s. His name was, if I'm wrong, maybe wrong, but I think his last name was Brown. And he was a medical doctor. He came to cure Nasruddin Shah or to just attend his. Then he wrote a book about Iranians. And the way he described Iranians was so Orientalistic. In one sense, he told his readers when he went back to Germany and publish his book, that he says Iranians don't have any idea of music. Their music is so primitive, so primitive. They don't, and then of course they pretend when they are in my presence, and he's talking about the elites in Iran, the most educated people of the time. When they are around me, they pretend to like classical musics, but it's only pretension. They are hypocrites. Now, just without really going into too much detail, if you had changed this idea of the Iranian elites not being polite and accommodating, and take that situation, and then if they were, what could they possibly do? They want to be accommodating to you. Of course, they like their own setar and Iranian music. But if they are in your presence and they like to listen to classical music because you like it, they're being polite, they're being civilized. You are the one who is uncivilized. You see, this is how we were seen and how we are still seen. And taking it back to the security issue, for example, right now, in the general context of US and Western media and Hollywood, obviously, the Israeli nuclear weapon, or France, or British, or others, is not a threat.
No, no.
It's not, even though US is the only country that has used it and is still using it in some ways, a threat of using it. But the possibility of the Iranian nuclear weapon is a threat. The possibility of Iranian missile is a threat. So it's not the missile in and of itself, because it's the same. Nuclear weapon in anybody's hand is the same, pretty much material. But so why is it that one bomb is a threat to international peace, and one bomb, or the possibility of another bomb, the same bomb, is in fact framed as deterrence, good for peace, good for deterring the enemies. You see, the material hasn't changed, the way it's perceived is changed. Pretty much as a black person or a brown person sitting next to a white person a whole lot of time in a racist context, whatever comes out of the white person's mouth, or in your example, Western scholarship, mainstream Western scholarship, in fact, not critical, because I'm a part of Western scholarship.
Yes.
I love it and I like it. And it is not Western. I don't like it to say it's Western or Eastern. It's human scholarship. It's critical humanistic scholarship.
Absolutely.
And it's not even nationalistic.
Yes.
I don't want to be a part of that. But nevertheless, the mainstream imperialist knowledge coming from the West
Yeah.
is perceived as more credible.
Yeah.
This is the idea of, again, colonial mind
Yes.
or mentality, coloniality.
Yes, absolutely. It reminds me, there are some people, if you're an Iranian, you write about Iran, you tend to be nationalistic. So then, okay, so you need to be from outside, someone told me. Okay, so you need to be American or European. Yeah. But what about if I write about America and Europe? Yeah, you don't know that well, right?
Yes, yes.
You
These
see
double
that?
standards continue. And going back to your original question of deterrence,
Yes.
so deterrence fits into this double standard. Deterrence is good and non-threatening, threatening and peacemaking and balance of power
Yeah.
for great powers.
Yes.
But the minute a middle power like Iran or other countries want to have deterrence, want to play into that game, of course, they become a threat. So the question that you had posed, which is really good, is does deterrence work? Of course, it works for great powers. Does it work for us? No, unfortunately, it hasn't worked. And of course, it's not the blame on all these countries that try to invest so much on deterrence, but obviously it's on the structure because the way it's framed. And you can see this double standard in many of these satellite news that are broadcasted in Iran and in Farsi. They buy so totally 100% without any critical view the total framing of the imperialist colonizing dominant knowledge produced in the United States. They don't even change it. They say they're Iranian and they are physically and heritage wise, but they're not. They say they're humanist, but they're not. Because if you are a humanist, a secular humanist, then you think that an Iranian perspective, an Iraqi perspective, and the life of an Afghan and a Russian and a Ukrainian and American, they are all dear.
Yes.
Their
Absolutely.
perspective, their religion, their ideas, their way of life, is equal, it's respectable. You don't have to like it, but it's respectable. It's their humanity. This is a humanist perspective, which is actually also an ethical perspective. And from the perspective of some, in my opinion, emancipatory theological perspective, that's also religious, godly, good. No matter what, no matter whether it's Jewish or Christians or Muslim or Buddhist, if you believe in that central principle on which each human being is the world, and the world, all of humanity is about each individual. So the life of one is the life of all. The dignity of one is the dignity of all. That is an ethical, theological liberation theology is based on that. But these people that talk, these talking heads, without even knowing it, I can't call them traitors because I don't know what they are traders too. But they're empty minded in a sense. They are non being in Francis Fanon ideology and lexicon. They're non being because they have no identity. They identify with their masters. They're not democratic by the very definition. They talk about democracy, but democracy that they want, the way they frame it, it's not democratic because it doesn't apply to everyone. You see where I'm going with that.
Yes. 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 Let me just go to the next question because it goes hand in hand. What role does deterrence play in shaping geopolitical strategy and maintaining international stability? You answered this question to a big extent, but to maintain international stability, can we say that deterrence is used to maintain international stability, Professor Sharifi?
Well, depend on how we define stability. Stability for who?
Okay.
Right now, deterrence, the nuclear powers, the legal nuclear powers, the five nuclear halves in the United Nations determine stability and what the stability is or what stability is not. In that sense, yes, they do. But in the larger sense, they actually create instability because the minute their stability, their position of power is threatened by any means, soft or hard, in fact, they go to war and they create war. So again, we have to go back to the idea of, defining what we mean by things that we say. Yes, they do create stability for the power elites,
I understand that.
but not for Iranians, not for Afghans,
Of
not
course.
for Syrians, not for Iraqis, not for Palestinians, not for Sudanese, not for Somalis, not for South Africans. How many countries should I mention?
Yeah.
And not ironically, not for Americans. I am an American citizen.
Yes.
I've been in this country and a part of this country for over 50 years.
Yeah.
It doesn't create security for me.
Yeah. I agree.
And of course, for millions of other Americans like me.
Yeah. I agree. I agree. Professor Sharifi, the next question is also dovetails. Does reliance on deterrence in geopolitics promote greater stability, or does it risk entrenching cycles of hostility and arms races? That's a very important question.
Well, deterrence by its definition again, even if it works, let's say for assume that imperialist definition and stability and deterrence and balance of power, all of it work within a realist. Conditions always changes. Countries become weaker. Their greed. They go based on that greed and wanting more. So by its very nature, it always is dynamic and is changing. And because of that change, you have to balance and rebalance. And every balancing and rebalancing, of course, is a war, is a regime change, is an attack. So this was the idea. I mean, you mentioned Ukraine and Russia. So it was very obvious that when Soviet Union fell, for whatever reason, when it imploded, the dynamic of balance of power changed. When Ukraine was created, in fact, the dynamic of power changed. And then the competition, as an example, for these two powers. Russia is still a great power. It's not an empire. But the West and NATO allies, they started expanding. So the expansion began and it always went on and on and on until it became 27 nations and now 30 nations next to the duo, to of course, Russia. Russia has to obviously come back and say, you know what? If I allow this, the next thing is going to be Russia itself, regime change in Russia. And of course, that's war. This is thinking that way. So long as one escalation creates another escalation. So it becomes a spiral effect. So in the long term, like I said, this concept of international order is very, very violent and very unstable. By its own nature, it's unstable. And it doesn't create peace. It creates perpetual wars. I challenge anyone to tell me 1 year where US and its NATO allies have not been in a war since World War II.
Nothing.
It's gonna go. This is perpetual war. It's not perpetual peace. It's perpetual war. And then when there is a war, it's a perpetual stop for ceasefire, not peace. The example right now is this ridiculous argument about upcoming ceasefire in Gaza. It's not forever, it's for 60 days. And they have been talking about it for 6 months. 6 months of talk and violence in this last episode for 6 weeks of war, but 6 weeks of ceasefire. It's a stopping, it's ceasefire, not peace. So, and that's a distinction. So we are always in the state of ceasefire. When we call it peace, we mean ceasefire. There is no peace. Right now, after 12-day war between Iran and Israel and US, we are again in another state of war.
Yeah, we are.
But we're just not shooting at each other at this point in time. And it may just happen tomorrow or the day after or next month or next year. But we're preparing for the next war. Iranians are, US is, Israel is. This is the state of condition. This is what I call regionally the concept of regional insecurity communities, where every country is constantly in a state of war.
Yes.
Because one of its neighbor may attack it with the backing of course, US NATO allies. In contrast with that, we have the state of peace, at least relative peace, among US NATO allies.
Yes.
And that was unimaginable. That can be, of course, in other countries. It can be applied to other countries.
Yes.
As you know, Europe was the bloodiest, cruelest continent on earth for the last 1,000 years.
Absolutely.
More people killed each other in Europe last 100 years than the Middle Easterns or Indians or Chinese or Africans killed each other in all of their history combined. Absolutely. Nothing has been as bloody. Since 1100s, Europe has been the bloodiest country, and it has taken more blood and exacted more blood from other countries than. 7 years ago, 8 years ago, it would be unimaginable for a German person like yourself to say that we're going to be in peace, true peace, with France. And you could just go back and forth from France to Germany without even knowing when you cross the border.
Yes.
That's a normative thing. Right now, to a French person, if you say Germans are your enemy, you say, oh my God, you are out of your mind.
Yes.
80 years ago, if you said Germans can be your friend, they would say what? My God, you are out of your mind. Germans cannot be trusted. Germans are rough. They are uncivilized. They're savages. They're from a different creed. They just all the things that they used to say about Germans and German used to say about French. Some of it is still, as you know, lingers in the language of common people when they talk pejorative about Germans and French. Cheapness of this, exactness of that, and these jokes. But there's a lingering legacy of that history. But that history has effectively disappeared. Now, in the Middle East, we had a primitive sort of regional security communities, because we didn't get into World War in the Middle East, World War II or III or I or whatnot. We didn't. There were conflict. There were small scale, low intensity conflicts. But never
Professor Sharifi, once a colleague of us from Mozambique told me, I never forget that. He told me, even when these guys have wars, call it world war. World war means all countries in the world are directly involved. Why do they call it a world war? Half jokingly, he was saying that, right?
No, that's true. But in some senses, they do make it world war because they get everybody involved.
Yeah.
Iran was involved. 2 million people died in World War I. 2 million people starved to death and died out of the consequences, direct and indirect consequences of World War II. Almost World War I, it was like 1/6 of the population starved to death. And we don't have, famine in Iran. We didn't have a history of that before that. Very small.
Yes.
But then it was a great famine during World War. Why? Because of course, we got involved, not that we wanted to get involved. Anyway, my main point is that, so, and I want to just conclude this, that it is possible. The US NATO allies have created a regional insecurity communities in the Middle East in order to, in fact, kind of the old way of divide and conquer. We in the Middle East, whether they are Egyptians or Jordanians or Saudis or Iranians, regardless of their nationalistic and sometimes too nationalistic, hyper nationalism, they need to create a regional security community where we do not allow power, coercion, and violence to determine how we deal with each other. We should develop the kind of norms that it would be impossible for an Afghan to say that Iran or Iranians are my enemy, or the other way around, like what is going on right now in Iran.
Yes.
In fact, with the mass deportation of Afghans.
Yes.
The Afghans are from the same civilizational. They used to be a part of Iran. Many of them, all of them almost, speak Farsi. There is no inherent conflict between Iran. And then, of course, racism, which is a modern colonizing concept.
It is a modern.
We didn't have racism 2,000 years ago.
They
didn't tell you, you are a slave because you're black or brown or yellow. This is a modern phenomenon of Western colonialism. The same people that say they are anti-racist, they created modern racism and slavery and colonialism and all the rest of it. And at this point in time, racism in Iran, racism against the Turks, against Kurds, against Baluch, against Fars, against Farsi speaking, or Afghans, or Pakistanis, or Indians. These are truly colonized mind of idiots that have again become non-being. They don't have their identity, their national identity is rooted in imperial concepts, colonizing concepts. We need to free ourselves. I'm sorry for preaching, but that's
No, thank you very much. Thanks for explaining insecurity communities. I would like to go to question number 6. You define multi-balancing, and it has become a recurring pattern in the US foreign policy. What is multi-balancing, Professor Sharifi? Can you explain that to our
Yes, yes. Okay, so let's just make it by, let's explain this concept by an example. Multi-balancing is the idea that a cheap way of dividing and conquering and ruling the Middle East. For US, since World War II, all of the Middle East is balanced against Israel. In other words, Israeli security is prioritized against the rest of the Middle East. But this is only one regime of security. And making an example, like for example, Saudi Arabia is not considered a friend of Israel, even with this Abraham Accord and all that, because they have to balance each other. If it comes to real thing, one of them has to be over the others. But that's not enough. Then once you have Israel, this is balancing Israel against rest of the Middle East, then you have to balance Saudi Arabia against Iran, the Gulf nations against Iran, Iraq against Iran. The whole conflict in the Middle East right now is the idea of this Middle Eastern multi-balancing. As you know very well, as long as Saddam was ruling Iraq, US had no problem with helping Saddam to balance against Iran.
Yeah.
It didn't like Iran, it didn't like Iraq and Saddam Hussein, but as Kissinger once says, let's weaken it, let's kill let them kill each other. This is multi-balancing.
Yes.
And of course, when Syria turned, Syria was supposed to be balancing with Iran rather than against it. Of course, it paid a huge price for that.
Yes.
But if, let's say, in this concept, let's say Syria right now is trying to be not balancing with Iran, but against Iran, with Saudi Arabia and US regime. That's not going to work.
Yeah.
That's not going to work, because if it empowers the Arabian countries to be more powerful than Israel, then US going to break one of them.
Yes.
This is the concept. This is the Churchillian concept. Winston Churchill. And of course, that's not his concept, but this is the dominant way of creating balances. If Afghanistan today, under the Taliban, whom I don't personally respect or like, but they are the ruling regime right now, if they become friends of Iran, US and NATO make sure that they're not anymore. One of them has to be enemy of the other. The same thing with Pakistan. With Pakistan, they're a brotherly country. We could trade with them. We could have free trade zone with them. We could send them our gas. They could, and they are. But US opposes that. Why? Because Pakistan can never be an ally of Iran. With Turkey, we are brotherly countries. Not that Erdogan is a brother. No. In fact, he has got the same imperialistic mind as Trump administration. But nevertheless, Iranians and Turkish people are brothers. They have a long history and they can cooperate with each other. Iraqi is the most important. As you know, all of southern Iraq could be a part of the territory of Iran. But who wants territory? Let's be friends with each other. We could be trading partners.
Yes.
We should be allowed to go to Baghdad with no visa, no security. They should come to Tehran, to Syria, to Saudi Arabia, to all the. This is what we need, but it is not allowed. We have not been allowed to create a regional security community in the Middle East. And some of our scholarship, Iranian scholarship, produces, many of them in US. Iranian studies, in fact, many of the mainstream people that are studying on Iran are traditional, toxificated, scholars that they still up to today, their framing of Arabs is so racist, is as bad as Zionist. And of course, because they think, oh, we're Persians, Iranians are of Aryan race, concept that didn't exist 400 years ago, 200 years ago, 150 years ago. And they just say it with no shame. So this is the problem. And this normative stuff, with your help and the help of whoever can, of course, can change if we really find our own identity. And we can create a regional security community. I mean, this is longer than this session allows, but definitely it can be done. It's possible. A different world is possible as long as we know what is wrong with this world.